If you work for someone 40 hours a week, then you spend a third of your waking hours being someone else, the person who pays you, in order that during the other 2/3 of your waking hours, you can be yourself. And by being yourself, I mean being free to lead as many different, even contradictory lives as you have in you, until at last they converge into one, into the one that must have called you into existence in the first place, mad for your body. At any rate, into the one you labored long and hard to create. I'm not anti-work, far from it. I love work if it's voluntary, otherwise it's rape, however submissive the victim or accommodating the assailant. Writing, for instance, is not a pleasant drive into the country. Every sentence is a strenuous foot of road under construction, but it leads to where I want to go. It leads to revolution, although I'm not exactly sure of the route it takes to get there. So I keep asking the road for directions, using words as a dowsing rod to lead me to life. Hell, I'm taking the road out for a ride. Sorry to interrupt, but it's time to go to work, time to paradox, time to be your boss so you can be yourself. You are nothing but me, my boss insinuates with every assignment. That's what I pay you for, to be nothing but me 40 hours a week. For 40 hours a week to be as much at my disposal as this rented floor I walk across. 1/3 of your week is mine, 2/3 is yours. That's not a bad split. Let's see whether it is or not. If I agree to work for someone, if I accept a job, and my experience is that the one thing worse than looking for a job is finding one, then I must subordinate my will to the will of another. I must be cooperative. That is, I must adapt my behavior to that of the owner, without expecting him or her necessarily to reciprocate. I must endure acting with the deference of one who trespasses on the premises with the owner's permission, instead of bearing myself with the confidence of a recognizable and enforceable equal. In short, I must acquiesce in my inferiority for as long as I wish to keep the job. So how do I differ from Uncle Remus slaving on a plantation in the antebellum American South? Primarily in this way. Remus is the property of someone other than himself. If his master frees him, then Remus and I are alike. After being freed, Remus is still property, but, and this is the peculiarly burgherish, the characteristically mercantile contribution to the history of human chicanery, he is his own property. He belongs to himself. But although he is his own property, once he is free, he cannot sell himself outright to someone and thus re-enter the condition of slavery. That's against the law. So his title of ownership to himself is non-transferable. However, once he is free, he can routinely rent or lease himself to another in return for wages. He can do it and must do it, not only to keep his property alive, but to watch it multiply into baby property. Okay, but what's the difference between renting myself out on a regular basis and selling myself outright? What's the difference between wage labor and slavery? Well, if I am a wage worker, the 2/3 of me who is at leisure during my waking hours volunteers to place the other working 1/3 of me at the disposal of a buyer of labor power. Volunteers? Now wait a minute. If 2/3 of me sells 1/3 of me, then that 1/3 person who has to work is as much a slave of the 2/3 person who picks him up at work every day and drives him home and spends the evening with him and goes to bed with him and gets him up in the morning and returns him to work, as ever Remus was to his master. In fact, that 2/3 person is one son of a bitch exploiter of the 1/3 person, and I'd slit his throat if by doing so I wouldn't cut my own. Yes, I'm sorry to say that when Abe Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, far from ending slavery or even driving it underground, he injected it under the skin. He must have signed that proclamation with a hypodermic needle instead of a pen, for slavery to have gone subcutaneous, and himself to have demonstrated extraordinary criminal cunning, to have concealed the great sickness of humankind in the last place anyone would look for it, in our very own heart. To continue then, when I work full-time, 2/3 of me, my leisured self, leases the other 1/3 of me, my work self, to someone called an employer. Thus the working 1/3 of me has no will of its own, but surrenders it to the other 2/3, to the freewheeling, free-feeling me, who acts as director and disposer of my total-willed activity. So, 1/3 of me is ancillary, the domestic servant, the familius of the other. 1/3 of me is as obedient as a slave. 2/3 of me is free. Unfortunately, however, I have only one body, a limitation which pushes me toward choosing between the two, slave or free, if, that is, I have any pretensions to being integral, to being a single person I can call myself. Furthermore, the premise of my free time, whether realistic or not, is that it is free without interruption, that the time at its disposal is without limit. That's what free time means. 5 minutes or 5 years, however long it takes before I look up from my meditation. So that when my free time is interrupted to become its opposite soul time, I either stick my head in the sand, go unconscious in order not to notice the collapse of my freedom, or I do notice it and act insolent out of impotence. My point is that my wage-earning self is not just an adjunct, an annex, a psychologically neutral extension of my leisured self, but rather contradicts it, calls it a liar. My soul self feels exactly that, sold out, betrayed, powerless, and therefore depressed, submissive, humiliated, and self-defeated. Its sensibility routinely shocked into unresponsiveness and rigidity, it becomes a drudge who works all the time, since work time is the only time it knows, while its leisured self lives off it like a spoiled child off an intimidated parent. So my boss at work connives with me to pretend I'm not a slave, so long as I do my part by splitting unobtrusively into owner and property and selling myself under the table. And if the pay is good, I'm happy to oblige, more than happy to degrade 1/3 of myself from a person to a thing, provided I get the raise, receive the bonus I was promised. Besides, if I have to alienate myself from myself in order to survive, I'd rather I do it than a stranger who doesn't understand me. In fact, I'm grateful to my boss for enrolling me in a do-it-yourself enslavement program. After all, it's only fair that I prove I can abuse myself before I am allowed to enjoy the privilege of abusing others. So let me plan my week. On Friday, when I leave work, I'll experience the exhilaration of escaping the slave who funds my weekends. On Saturday, as I walk down Melrose, I'll dismiss this slavish I from my mind as utterly as a landlord at dinner forgets his tenants. On Sunday, I continue my revel until the evening, when I get the Sunday blues. Then I prepare myself for death. Just as I expected, the slave has escaped, and sometime during the night, while I slept, has murdered me. On Monday, I am returned to work dead on arrival, except that I am no longer I, but it. It, he means me, the slave who murdered his master, the slave who murdered his freedom. I don't talk much at work on Monday because I mourn the death of my worklord, whom I had to kill, otherwise I'd starve to death. On Tuesday, a new owner arises like a phoenix from Monday's ashes. On Wednesday, owner and owned are united in alchemic wedlock. On Thursday, thirsty for freedom, the owner files for divorce. On Friday, I am the owner. Saturday, I revel. On Sunday, I climb out of my person and slip into my thing. The Romans call Christianity a slave religion. And doesn't the myth of the crucified and resurrected God fit the work week to a T? On Sunday, the father becomes son, the owner becomes property, is crucified. Sunday night blues. On Monday, the employee is voiceless, inanimate property, Jesus crucified and buried. On Tuesday, life stirs, the seed bursts, the property, the thing becomes animate. On Wednesday, Jesus resurrects, and on Thursday joins his Father in heaven. On Friday, Jesus and God are one. Property and owner are reunited. The property has regained its owner form. On Saturday, the God-owner lives. On Sunday, the God-owner is brought to earth to be re-crucified. If myth displaces consciousness, the back of Christianity must be broken for mankind to stand tall. We still have slavery, except, as I say, it's gone deeper than underground. It's gone unconscious. The slave quarters are hidden out of sight, such that no government team of inspectors can find it. The slave lives inside the master. On Monday, the master changes back into the slave. The slave's voluntary will shivers into place. How many times can you freeze and unfreeze a piece of meat before it spoils? The culture also provides a non-Christian metaphor to describe the transmogrification of Sunday into Monday. The mad scientist who changes into a fly but gets mangled in the process, the chromosomes snag and tear, so that the fly has a human head, says the slave. So that the head has a fly's body, says the master. As you know, so long as labor is scarce, enslaving beats hiring by a long shot. And if you treat your slaves well, they'll multiply for you, so you won't have to purchase replacements for the ones who die. But when the number of slaves increases beyond the amount of work available for them to do, and that situation develops, the more rapidly, the more extensively machine replaces manual labor, then the expense of maintaining the slave population progressively consumes more and more the profit derived from keeping the slave. So, Mr. President, what we was wondering is whether you care to purchase our herd, since I understand you are short of hands in Schittsburg. As we know, Lincoln chose not to purchase, but to brazenly steal it. No, he didn't end slavery. He streamlined it, renovated it, updated it by applying the principle of the division of labor to slavery. From a master's point of view, the slave divides into the working productive and the recuperating unproductive slave. The only difference the Industrial Revolution has made is to transfer the master's burden of upkeep to the slave itself. For as anyone knows who has ever rented a car or a power tool, if the fucking thing breaks, you don't have to repair it. You return it to the agency and get another. Because the general agreement is that if the owner and the user of a piece of property are different persons, and the user pays the owner a rental fee, then the primary responsibility for the upkeep of the property falls to the owner, not to the user. I also am a fucking thing that breaks. But if I am the legal owner of myself, instead of co-owner of the entire enterprise as far as the eye can see, along with everyone else who has eyes to see it, and therefore liable for the upkeep and repair of same, Then if I keel over at work from suppressed rage, my boss doesn't have to bury me like a slaveholder had to dispose of his broken work dolls. Or if I'm fed up with referring to abuse as stress and call it by its right name, my boss is not obliged to find a buyer to take me off his hands. Nope. All my boss has to do is to squeeze the trigger of termination, and I am discharged, fired, body and soul, out of the barrel of employment, into the air of joblessness. Self-contracting rental equipment. That's my status if I earn a wage. Broken equipment. My status if I don't. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth a nation consisting entirely of property owners, millions of minnow masters, thousands of carp, hundreds of sharks, and a few leviathan, all happily swimming about, one within the other, in a bucket the size of the sea. If, in fact, when I work for wages, I routinely subordinate my will to another, then the conclusion is inescapable that I participate in a system in which I slave for another. But although universal, this is not legal slavery. This is tacit under-the-table slavery, without which supply of cheap labor the owners of modern civilization would go bankrupt. So while Remus knew he was a slave, I'm a slave that has been conned and bullied into believing that I am free. And therefore not only am I a slave, but a fool to boot, for having allowed myself to be mentally conditioned not to find alarmingly incongruous, remarkably rude, and offensively smug the settled opinion that a body which only lives once and is at one and the same time priceless to itself and worth $7.07 an hour to another. Let me read that last sentence again. And therefore, not only am I a slave, but a fool to boot, for having allowed myself to be mentally conditioned not to find alarmingly incongruous, remarkably rude, and offensively smug the settled opinion that a body which only lives once is at one and the same time priceless to itself and worth $7.07 an hour to another. Near the end of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, after Prospero dispels the enchantment which has prevented the characters from re-establishing contact with each other, and they are finally reunited, the old counselor Gonzago, who has already sounded the utopian motif, remarks that the king's daughter Claribel found a husband in Tunis, her brother Ferdinand found a wife where he was a castaway, that Prospero found his dukedom in the same small island, and all of us ourselves when no man was his own. Since Prospero held them spellbound by no man was his own, Gonzago means that all were reunited when no man was in his right mind. Now, presumably a man is in his right mind when he is in his own mind, not in somebody else's, and particularly not in Prospero's. If the character is in Shakespeare's mind, is he in his right mind? And he is in his own mind when he is fully conscious that his body is the property of the consciousness that pervades it. The body doesn't own the consciousness owns the body. Even though it exhibits a face, the body, according to the Elizabethans and their able-minded burgher descendants, who devised this cumbersome and abusive splitology to justify their avoidance and shifting of oppressive labor to the able-bodied, the body is not considered to be a person. The awareness is the person. So, Gonzago implies that when no one was in his right mind, when no body knew who it belonged to, all the bodies came to their senses. All the bodies found their right minds. Actually, all the bodies were of one mind, the mind of Prospero. Therefore, Gonzago finally means that when no body belonged to its own consciousness, but all the bodies belonged to the Prospero consciousness, everyone got along and was happy. Yeah, I'm sure Joseph Stalin would agree. Nevertheless, the utopian radiance of the idea fascinates. We all belong to each other when no one belongs to him or herself. All of us together own each one of us. The association owns the membership. Now, if the association owns the members, then the members are slaves to the association. But the association is not a real person like a slave master. It is not even a legal person like a corporation. Since the association is not a real person, the slavery must be qualified. The association is an idea. Hence, the members are slaves to an idea. And the idea they are slaves to is this, that inasmuch as the body of each is of inestimable value to its possessor, all human bodies are equally priceless. Accordingly, this subjective equality translates in the real world into the conviction, overriding every consideration of the social contribution of its possessor, that all bodies are of equal economic value and deserve to be maintained in equally good condition. But that takes money. How much is the association worth? How much is mankind worth? Mankind's worth is equal to the value of the gross global product. Therefore, each person's worth is equal to the gross global product divided by the number of producer dependents. In other words, the species, the ultimate association, owns its members, but owns them equally, which means that each member is entitled by birth to an equal share of the gross global product. So, even if I'm a faster runner than you, score higher than you, am more eligible, have more social connections, am in greater demand, am better versed, have more wit, have greater insight, have worked harder and accomplished way more than you. Since we have the same amount of money in the bank, since we are equally solvent or equally broke, we must be equal. That's what it's like when the idea of economic equality owns us. It's capital when each person is legal owner of and individually responsible for him or herself. And if two people are mutually responsible for each other, that's love. But if 3 or more people are mutually responsible for each other, if 300,000 million or more people are collectively responsible for each other, that's conspiracy against the state. That's revolution. Quote, "The negation of capitalism begins with capitalism itself, but even in the phases that precede revolution, there is active the rational spontaneity that will animate the post-revolutionary phases." Herbert Marcuse. I apologize for choking up, but sometimes phrases really grab me, like rational spontaneity. Revolution is revolting. Now let the drops collect. Trickles mount up. Don't be discouraged when streams run dry. Let's start that one again. Some of these are like poems, and some are prose, and some are mottos, and some of the pieces are war cries. Now let the drops collect. Trickles mount up. Don't be discouraged when streams run dry. We're pooling deep in the earth. Not by nature, but by will. With your consent, this tiny bead of moisture which is me, I will to flow into you. Although I cannot see, I feel our merger. Some day we'll have shores in the light. Now we must fight. Hang on tight. We're bubbles and we're vulnerable. The human species is irresistibly, if covertly imagined by all, to be a creature who is alive, has a history, lives alone, talks to itself. 5 billion voices, each with a mind of its own, each with a different history, each a strand of self-weaving cloth, tails hooked like worms into wiggleware. Poor androgynous mammy Menschlichkeit. Your body's history. By means of your body, the living, the dead, the unborn exchange views. Behold a single spectacle. What is the age of the species? How old is humanity en masse? Well, that question can be answered if we rephrase it this way. What is the age of the abstract person to whom advertisers appeal when they attempt to sell their products in the mass market? 12 years old, the marketeers report. Okay, let's suppose the species turned 12 years of age with the formation of the 12 tribes of Israel. So, we've been 12 for about 3,000 years. It is possible then that one species year equals 3,000 person years. Therefore, projecting backwards and multiplying 12 times 3,000, we can claim with some plausibility that the species was born roughly around 36,000 BC. And projecting forward that the species will reach the age of retirement in the year 187,000 AD. If we live to 100, we'll become extinct in 225,000 AD. We have a long life ahead of us. In the meantime, it's possible that on New Year's Eve, 1999, we turn 13. Happy bar mitzvah, you neo-Nazis! 12 as a kid, 13 an adult. I can't wait to celebrate. Forget political parties. The revolution will be a year long, a 3,000-year-long birthday party. Birthdays are Earth days, the days on which we were unearthed, one in Boulder, another in Bolivia, but in the same house. What does that make us? Rumors? Neighbors? Cousins? A milling crowd. It makes us Earthlings. Vata und Muda. Water and mud blow-dried into automotive pie. Kickstart cake. Once a year, I try to cope with having awakened alone on a thrown birthstone. Order, orient, orior, Latin, to rise, ort, German, the place where it rises. From the great Indo-European root ri, whence rishi, a seer, ritual, rite, to appear out of the blue, to arise. Order implies origin. Out of order, origin unknown. When we say that a machine is out of order, we imply that by breaking, it has rejected its human provenance. It has lost contact with home. It is at large in nature. It is homeless. But a person must risk homelessness to move on. First we orient ourselves. Then we complete our orientation by occidenting. Herding animals, that is, animals which herd year-round rather than merely collect for brief periods for the purpose of propagating their kind, use their gregariousness to protect themselves against two kinds of danger. Danger from above, that is, from a direct assault by a predator, and danger from below, from depletion of resources leading to scarcity and starvation. Instinctively, with no more deliberation than a nut requires to shelter the meat, or than the outer animals of the herd, merely by arranging themselves in the most effective way to defend themselves, protectively encircle the animals within. So the members of such a herding or gregarious society split into two classes in order to double the chances for survival of the society as a whole. From the point of view of the poor the meat of the nut, the inner core of the herd, the function of the rich is to bear the brunt of an assault by enemies from without, intent upon destruction of the herd. From the point of view of the rich, the shell of the nut, the outer edge of the herd, the poor function as a source of nourishment and as a barometer of danger from famine and disease. As the poor begin to perish, the rich hopefully have time to devise a new, more effective survival strategy to forestall becoming an empty shell or a scattered herd. Does society evolve or revolve or devolve or thoughtlessly and blindly merely involve the participants? Evolution implies the image of a scroll unfolding the contents of a predetermined text. The genes contain the scenario. The individual simply acts it out. The past massively outweighs the present as a determinant of action. In that sense, Darwin's theory is similar to the Bible. Evolution, turned out of the house of the past, of the house of the Lord, in everlasting eviction. Revolution, returning home, to evict the evictor. Devolution, lost while returning home. The surplus of primary production supported specialist craftsmen, metalworkers, sculptors, carpenters, leatherworkers, potters. V. Gordon Childe. Unquote. If everyone owns history equally, then each is entitled to share in the profit, to graze the cattle of desire upon the commons of global wealth. Quote, if so, the royal tombs symbolize, as in Sumer, the emergence of an earthly ruler to consecrate the social surplus and utilize it as capital for reproductive or militaristic purposes. Unquote. V. Gordon Childe. Let's say that X is aware of itself. That means that X has imagined another self, call it R, looking at X. Suppose also that Y is aware of itself. That means that Y has imagined another self, call it S, looking at Y. Now let X and Y become lovers. That is, let X and Y imagine that their bodies have merged into a single body, XY, which in turn is observed by a single observer, RS. What was formerly the solitary mirror of self-consciousness in the mind of each is imagined by each to conflate into a relational persona or imaginary person called the relationship. Finally, the relationship in turn is imagined by the lovers to have a spiritual dimension, that is, to be capable of being aware of itself. In other words, the lovers have imagined a mutual point of view which wouldn't exist without their efforts, but which, once it exists like a newborn child, exists independently of its creators. But what proof do the lovers have that the relationship exists independently of them? Their proof is mostly faith that when the lovers are together, their luck improves. Furthermore, if lovers choose to, they are able to imagine that the erotic pleasure produced by their respective genitals in the course of fucking is a product of a common relational genital whose pleasure they share. The common relational genital is a fiction, but as a result of this fiction, they soon discover that the frequency increases of being able to read each other's mind. Hence, the fiction has produced real results. Now, only to the extent that the fiction is convincing are real results possible. So, in order to make the fiction convincing, the lovers enter into a prolonged and complex psychological negotiation whereby each transfers ownership of self to the other. That is, lover A enslaves herself to lover B but lover B likewise enslaves himself to lover A. Each is master of and slave to the other. In other words, within this duocracy which they have created, the lovers are free and equal, although the freedom of each is conditioned by the freedom of the other. This duocracy seems to work in a two-body relationship. Why not in a 3 or 3 billion body relationship, where for the sake of establishing a cooperative instead of competitive world, everyone has agreed to transfer ownership of themselves to a fictional person called Menschlichkeit, the first, the one, the only, whose single body everyone shares. To return to the lovers, I need hardly mention that in going from self-possession, the bourgeois ideal, for how can you sell yourself or even give yourself away unless you own yourself, to joint or common possession, the proletarian ideal, the lovers must pass through the perilous and vulnerable phase of dispossession, during which, under the cover of equality, one lover might be tempted by the other's defenselessness to dominate the relationship. If one lover does succumb to the temptation to dominate the relationship, then the two-member social body of the lovers approaches the absolute limit, without ever attaining it, of a one-member social body. In other words, if lover A dominates lover B, then A demands that B devote its power of self-awareness to A. The more B focuses on A, the less B is aware of itself. But as B disappears into A, the two-ness of the relationship, its duality, degenerates into unity, deflates instead of mounts up into unity. A engulfs B in unity. B goes down for the third time towards zero self, drowning in A's gulf of unity, gulp of unity. One squared, however inflated the one may be, is still one. The fiction that A and B share the same body becomes less and less convincing the more A dominates the relationship. To go from micro to macro politics, in 1917 the Russians transferred ownership of themselves to a political party which was supposed to be a fiction. But the fiction trespassed onto reality when the power invested in the fiction devolved on a real person, namely the dictator of the proletariat. Fiction lays the foundation for constructing the abstract person, in whom everyone equally participates. But should this person acquire representatives who possess greater authority derived from the fiction than others, then the fiction degenerates into fact. The freedom which the fiction epitomizes, inasmuch as it is freely imagined, petrifies into necessity. Quote, 9 tablets from a small family archive found at Nippur in 1950-51, writes classical scholar M.I. Finley, reveals how, during a siege of the city in the 7th century B.C., young children, all but one of them girls, were sold for token sums, and 2 of the texts employ a very impressive formula. Take my small child and keep her alive, that I may eat. Unquote. Final report of the Children's Employment Committee of 1866, quoted by Karl Marx in Capital. It is unhappily, to a painful degree, apparent throughout the whole of the evidence that against no persons do the children of both sexes so much require protection as against their parents. Unquote. The present era of universal self-ownership marks a stupid time, between a bad time when some people owned other people and a good time coming, when as the result of everyone owning everyone equally, no one owns anyone equally. Slavery, knavery, savory, the 3 phases of humankind. The goal is the golem, the goylem, the girl in the boilum, a massive alchemic mind, until now collectively unconscious. And what is the collective unconscious, if not the potential for global cooperation become conscious and actual, which the revolution sparks into life like the bolt of lightning Frankenstein's monster, that particular monster being the negative shadow side of the spectator, closely watching each of us from inside each, until everyone regarding each other from the same vantage, from the same advantage point, at last the spectator catches sight of itself and awakens. Yes, God is buried in each of us, but until we find each other, God remains unresurrected. You thought it was the other way around, didn't you? That first we discover God and then each other. No. God prays daily for the revolution, which marks the birth pangs of divinity. For what's the sense of uniting mankind unless the unity becomes personified, takes on a personality with a will of its own, and with several billion bodies to implement that will? Hail, Menschlichkeit, the first, the one, the only, who at present is split into Lord of the Weekend and Employee of the Month, into owner and property, into Prospero and Caliban. But as Shakespeare, tapping into the collective unconscious, prophetically declares, Caliban found his Prospero, and Prospero his Caliban, one within the other, and each within himself, and all of us ourselves, when no man was his own. That is, anyone I meet reminds me of me, to the extent that I believe I'm beginning to be everyone, and to the same extent I'm beginning to be myself. All of us found ourselves when no man was his own. All of us were restored to our right mind, all right, but the part of our mind from which we were separated and which was temporarily lost to us continued to evolve without our knowledge into a different mind from the one we had left, such that, look, I was out of my mind. You were out of yours. While I was out of my mind, finding itself separated from me, it went in search of me. Same with yours. While you were out of your mind, finding itself separated from you, it went in search of you. But instead of you, it encountered the part of my mind looking for me. Hello there, I'm looking for Alonzo. Have you seen him? No, I haven't. By the way, I'm looking for Gonzalo. Have you seen him? No, I haven't. Say, you look familiar. You look familiar, too. And happening to glimpse their reflections in the pool of reflection, the part of Alonzo's mind which Alonzo left behind, and the part of Gonzalo's mind which Gonzalo left behind, were amazed to discover that they looked as much alike as identical twins. And being psychic and not physical entities, no body stood in the way of their merging into a single face reflected on the surface of the water. In the meantime, when at last I returned to my own mind, I found myself to be a me of whom I was no longer the sole proprietor. In other words, a me to whom I no longer held exclusive title. And when you returned to yourself, you had a similar experience. You found yourself to be a you, of whom you were no longer the sole proprietor, to whom you no longer held exclusive title. We co-own ourselves now. And if we still have separate bodies, all the better for our unity to rub us together with satisfaction.